Hello there, class. So this is just a brief video that I put together talking about the Milgram obedience experiment. Now, if you're online today, your assignment was to watch an ed puzzle, and in that ed puzzle, you'll have witnessed actual video from this experiment. So you have probably a better sense than I could ever give you of what happened during the Milgram obedience experiment. However, I decided to make this video because there are some things that don't get covered there that they're not necessarily going to be on the test, but you might find them really interesting. I've always found the Milgram obedience experiment to be one of the most interesting in the history of psychology. So I'm going to say a little bit about what inspired it, and I'm going to tell you about some other versions of the Milgram experiment that sort of cast light on why his results turned out the way they did. So first of all, Milgram's experiment is not really built to test a hypothesis of Milgram's. It's built to test the Shirer Hypothesis. It said the German people are particularly obedient and that they were ready to follow the instructions of authority figures without question. In essence, the Shirer Hypothesis, which is believed by a lot of people in the years after the Holocaust, is that the Holocaust would not be possible anywhere but Germany because it's this unique German character of obedience that made the Holocaust possible. And what Milgram wanted to do is test this hypothesis and find out whether the Holocaust could happen other places other than Germany, or whether it was just specifically a German thing. So to do that, he needed to design a situation in which Germans could be obedient when asked to do something immoral. So in a lot of ways, we run into the same problem as we did with the Bobo doll experiment. Are we going to how are we going to put our subjects in a position to do something violent or immoral without actually leading to violent and immoral things being done in society? And so what he did, as you know if you watch the ed puzzle, is he had participants administer electric shocks to a participant in a memory study. He had a scientist ask them to do it, and what Milgram wanted to see was whether people would continue to obey as their participant began to scream and make complaints about their heart and express all sorts of concerns and even seem to die. So in order to do that, Milgram sets up this complicated situation where there's a fake participant that meets his actual participants and then goes to another room, sets up a recording device, and plays through this series of reactions to a hypothetical memory experiment. And as you probably also know from the video, Milgram will complete this experiment in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And what you might not realize is that experiment that you saw was supposed to be the control group. He wanted to see how normal people reacted and then test how Germans reacted. But he never did get around to conducting the experiment with Germans because, as you would also know from the video, he found that even people in the supposed control group in Bridgeport, Connecticut, were incredibly obedient to the demand to shock their fake participant in this fake memory study. Milgram's results, 65%, about 2/3 of participants were willing to shock up to 450 volts. And they kept administering shocks long after the person they're administering shocks to had theoretically stopped giving answers and had complained about their heart and had screamed many times. So the next few slides I'm going to show you come from an activity I do in class sometimes, where I present some other versions of Milgram's experiment. These are things he really did. Once he discovered his original results, he wanted to find out, well, he thought by conducting 10, 20, 30 variations of his experiment, he could get to the bottom of what was causing people to be so incredibly obedient. So he conducts a lot of different versions of this experiment that are all just a tiny bit different from the original. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this tiny difference, and then I'm going to show you how that affected his results. All right, so first variation, Milgram moved his experiment from Yale to, which is where it was originally held, to an office building in a town. And after he did that, he conducted the experiment again. He wanted to see, in this case, the question is, how did being at Yale University, how did the fact of being at Yale, the prestige of Yale and of college universities in general, how did that affect his results? It turns out it affected them significantly. So when you do that, when you move from Yale University to just an office building, obedience drops from 65% to 48%. So what that tells us is that people are more likely to be obedient to prestigious authorities that have some sort of scientific aura about them than they are to just people who happen to be working in an office building. But people are still fairly obedient in this circumstance as well. So next, we're going on with the same line of reasoning. Milgram replaced the lab coat-wearing experimenter with a regular person. So how's that going to affect his results? If it's just a regular person, the person doesn't have any sense of science about them, and they're just wearing regular clothes and they're delivering these same commands, how's that going to affect things? Well, it turns out it affects them a lot. Obedience goes down to 20% from 65%. So the perceived authority of, just like in the last, when they moved it away from Yale, the perceived authority of the institution made a big difference. Or the perceived authority of the experimenter also makes a big difference. All right, so now what he did was he kept the experimenter scientific, kept them in a prestigious location, but he had the experimenter only talk to the participant who's deciding whether or not to shock people over the phone. And so instead of being right there in the room and saying the experiment requires that you continue, the experimenter is saying the experiment requires that you continue over the phone. And the question is, what percent, how does that affect obedience? It turns out that being distant from the person who's demanding obedience makes it a lot easier to disobey. Obedience drops to 21% from 65%, remember. All right, so now Milgram put the learner, person being shocked, in the same room with the participant. What percent of people are still going to continue shocking all the way? Well, a lot of times I give this to people and they say, well, it'll be like 0% now because they can see it. It'll be so much more powerful for them. But actually obedience stays pretty high. It stays at 40%. It makes a lot bigger difference how much authority the experimenter, the person who's giving the commands, seems to have than it does how close these people are to, physically to the person they're shocking. Now, that's about physical proximity, but what if instead of being a stranger, the learner was a friend of the participant, and the friend is in another room, they've got the experimenter with them in the room? How does this affect our obedience level? And it turns out that friendship matters a lot more than physical proximity. So obedience is going to be 15%. in this situation. So if there's one variable that's really had a huge effect so far, I mean, obviously the authority, perceived prestige and authority of the experimenter has had a big effect. Also, actually, friendship, so emotional closeness with the learner has a tremendous impact. So this is an argument for people being more emotionally friendly and close and connected to one another in society in general. Because if they are, then people will be less likely to to follow immoral commands that force them to do things that are wrong to other people. Of course, there's other variables to look at as well. Milgram conducted the experiment using women instead of men as subjects. What percent of women would be obedient? His first experiment is all men, and a lot of people look at it and they say, well, women would be less brutal, less violent. Women would be less likely to push all the way to 450 volts. Or there are other people, and I realize this perspective is going to sound really sort of grotesque, but there are people who will be like, well, women are more likely to be obedient than men, and so they would expect it to be higher. But it turns out there's no difference. Milgram, when he conducts the experiment with women, women have the same percent likelihood of being obedient to immoral commands as men do. They're no higher, no lower, exactly the same. And of course, I told you earlier that Milgram never took his experiment to Germany. And he says famously, I found so much obedience in America, I hardly saw the need for taking the experiment to Germany. But I'd have been curious to find out how it would have worked out. So it's a shame to me that he never did. Especially, it'd be interesting to know if having this historical memory of having committed the Holocaust as a society, if maybe that would have inclined people to be more wary of following commands, which might be my hypothesis. But he didn't conduct it, and so that's one thing we'll never know about the Milgram experiment, because today the Milgram experiment does not get conducted anymore. It is not even variations of it, because it's perceived as an unethical experiment that can do potential damage to its subjects. All right, and that's all I wanted to add to what was in the Ed puzzle regarding the Milgram experiment. And I hope those of you who watched this video have enjoyed it. I'm not sure that's quite the right word, but found it interesting or intriguing. Let me know if you got any questions or thoughts about the Milgram experiment. There are some other variations, and I can definitely send those along to you and allow you to do some more research if you're interested. That's all I have for you.